This final one we'll look at before I have you do one of these on your own. If you're a Cubs fan, this will become familiar to you really soon as far as what this is talking about if you've watched the 2012 season at all. This graph represents the number of home runs hit by Cubs players in 2012 that have at least one home run. So if you think about what this graph actually represents, okay, it doesn't represent these 5 numbers. Those are just parts that we're going to label that will talk about all the data. But this graph represents every single player for the Cubs that hit one home run or more. So that could be like 20-some players. It could represent, I could list all their names here. We could put all the amounts of home runs underneath each one. This graph represents many different players that at least hit one home run for the Cubs this year. Now, if we go to label the actual parts, again, we've got the minimum, we've got the maximum. The middle of the box is the median. The top of the box is the upper quartile, and the bottom of the box is the lower quartile. That's everything labeled there. We could get the percentages. From here to here is 25%. 25%, 25%, and this big line from here to here also represents 25% of the information. So basically, when we take a look at this graph, it should jump out to you that most of the graph is on the left-hand side. That's saying that 25, 50, 75. 75% of the players that hit one home run or less have 7 or fewer. That means that the Cubs didn't hit very many home runs. Only 25% of those players hit anywhere from 7 to 21. So when you see a graph that's skewed to the left, that means a lot of the numbers were low. So make sure that that's something you keep in mind. So we've talked about basically 3 types of graphs. That very first one, and I can click back real quick, that very first one was really evenly distributed. That means that between 7 and 27, it's about even as far as the categories here. When we look at this one, it means that a lot of the numbers were big because most of our information is up here in the bigger numbers. But when I come here, most of the numbers are small because 75% of the numbers are below 7. So that's how you should really read this graph. If we go to find the mean, median, mode, and range, if we were to find the mean, we would have to know every single player that hit one home run or more, and we'd have to add them all up, the numbers of home runs, and divide by how many players there were. We don't have that information at this time. The median. Yep, we have that. It's right here. It's the middle line here. So that means if we lined up all the numbers of all the home runs that people hit, the middle number would be 5. Which also should tell you something about how many home runs the Cubs hit. If we go for the mode, we don't know which one happened the most. If I had all the numbers listed here of all the players that hit home runs, then we could figure out the mode, but we don't, so we can't. And the range. Highest number minus lowest number, 21 minus 1. We have a range of 20 home runs here. So those are the only 2 we could find. These 2 we cannot because we don't have the numbers all listed. This next one, I'm going to ask you to do on your own here. And here are the questions that I want you to think about before continuing this video. First of all, I want you to think about how many data points would this represent. Now, a lot of you may not be familiar with Tampa Bay Buccaneers football. I follow them pretty closely. What can you tell about this graph from looking at how it's shaped? And this graph represents the number of wins for each year for the Buccaneers. So this would be how many data points does this graph represent? You don't have to know the exact number, maybe more of what would you have to know how many data points it represents. You could look it up also. I want you to label the quartiles, the median, the maximum, and the minimum. I want you to answer the question, can you tell what the mean, mode, or range are? And I should put median as well. Can you tell that from just looking at this graph? If you can, answer it. If you can't, say why. And then what does the shape of the graph tell you? What does this shape of this graph tell you about the history of Buccaneers football as far as their wins per season? Take a second, stop this, answer all these questions as best as you can, then start the video back up and we'll kind of see how you did. For the first question, how many data points does this represent? I looked back specifically, but the Buccaneers' history, they were kind of an expansion team in the late 70s. So if you go late 70s to 80s to 90s to late 2000s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, that's 30 some years they've been around. So that means that this graph represents 30 some years. So that means like if they started in 1978, we would list 1978, here's how many wins they had. 1979, here's how many wins. 1980, here's how many wins. 1981, here's how many wins, all the way up to the present time. I didn't include this year just because it's not done yet, but that's what the graph would represent. That's how many data points you would have, 30 some. To label the quartiles are at the ends of the boxes, lower quartile, upper quartile, and again, that just represents the middle of below the median, the middle of above the median. Meaning if I had all the years listed out and all the numbers, and I found the median, below the median, the lower quartile would be the middle of below the median. The upper quartile would be the middle of the upper numbers. The median goes in the middle of the box. And sometimes it's not aligned in the middle. You'll see here it's not aligned in the middle. Okay, that's the median. And by the way, the lower quartile would be 3 right there, and I did my graph by 2s because that fit. The median looks like it'd be 5, and the upper quartile looks like it's right on the 6. Maximum numbers here, which means that the most wins the Buccaneers have ever had is 12 in a season. And then back in their inaugural year, they had 0 wins. So the fewest wins that they've had is 0. As far as these questions here, the mean, we can't find because we don't have a list of all the years and how many times they won. If we did, we could add them up and divide by how many years they've been playing. The mode is also out. We would have to have all those years and figure out which one happens the most. The range, that's doable. That's 12 minus 0. So 12 minus 0 is 12. The median, also doable because it's right on the graph, right here. It's 5. So the middle most numbers that they won would be 5 games. If I listed them all out in numerical order from like their 0 wins from every year all the way up to their 12 wins that they had, 5 would be in the middle. And then the shape of this graph, well, if we think back, from here to here it's 25%, 25%, 25%, and 25%. So that means that 75% of the numbers are down here. 75% of the time, they won 6 or fewer games. So if you know anything about Buccaneers football, most of the time they stink. Only 25% did they ever have more than 6 wins. Hopefully all this clears up box and whiskers plots. Again, don't worry about the quartiles so much right now because later on in this unit, you will be actually finding the quartiles.